Everybody likes a good story about murder, and the gorier the better. But is it really okay to enjoy stories about real people suffering and dying? Let's get into that. Stories about crime, particularly murder, have been popular as long as people have been telling stories. From bards singing murder ballads in the Middle Ages to printed newsletters and pamphlets in the Victorian era, all the way up to the 1800s, to books, movies, docuseries. It's one of the most popular genres ever, actually. The genre continued into the mid-20th century with the true crime pulps. You might remember these. They're the magazines printed on cheap pulp paper, and the covers are kind of known for their almost pin-up quality and sometimes for the really graphic crime scene photos inside. They were mostly known for describing horrible murders and the hard-boiled cops who brought the perps to justice. But true crime made its first foray into respectability in 1966 when Truman Capote published his book In Cold Blood, which was about the murder of the Clutter family in Kansas. It was so popular that the rights for the movie were optioned before he was even finished writing the book. It was released in theaters the very next year. But the emergence of what we would call modern true crime television started in 1996 with a little series called The New Detectives, which later changed to Forensic Files. It was and still is the longest running and most popular true crime television show in the United States. And it set the standard for almost every other true crime story that came after it. The creator, Paul Dowling, said he structured each episode like a murder mystery, starting with the discovery of the victim's body or when the victim goes missing. In between Peter Thomas's iconic narration, there are interviews with the victim's friends and family, so we get to know a little bit about this person and the circumstances under which they were murdered or went missing. Then we hear from the investigators and, importantly in this series, the scientists who solved the case. In between all of this were some pretty scene-chewing recreations, but that was part of its charm. And while today not all true crime shows fit this exact formula, they tend to use a lot of the same elements. And today, in 2021, true crime is still the most popular genre in every medium, from books to podcasts to docuseries to television shows. On television, there are not one, not two, but three entire networks whose entire programming schedule is devoted to true crime. And even in sort of mainstream channels, news magazine shows like 2020 and Dateline regularly feature true crime stories. There are a lot of reasons why people enjoy true crime. For one, some of us are just really fascinated with anything that's taboo or off limits. Two, it's kind of like a horror movie, something where you can get a vicarious thrill and be sort of scared, but from the safety of your own couch. Three, people enjoy a well-told story with lots of emotional drama and high stakes that wraps up into a nice, neat conclusion, which doesn't always happen in real life. Four, a lot of people enjoy stories where they have to solve a mystery, and that's how a lot of true crime shows and documentaries are structured. You have to sort of figure it out from the clues, and that's challenging. A lot of people enjoy that. Five, and of course, there's the natural human curiosity about death. It's a phenomenon so common it even has a name, the rubbernecker effect. Six, it can be empowering, especially for women who are overwhelmingly the demographic who are true crime fans. Even though statistics show that women are less likely than men to be victims of violent crime, women think about being victimized much more frequently. Thanks to the ingrained victim blaming of our culture, we are much more likely to think about ways in which to avoid becoming victims of violent crime. Women and girls in our culture are constantly being given tips on how to maintain their safety. The women in my audience know exactly what that means. How to carry your keys between your fingers as you walk toward your car, how to check the back seat of your car to make sure there's not an attacker waiting for you, which streets not to walk down, which skirts not to wear ad nauseum. And true crime can kind of fall into that category. It can serve as a kind of training material where watching these true crime shows can show us like the common techniques that serial killers and abusers often use to lure in their victims, so we can feel prepared and not fall for that. And when victims survive to tell their stories, that also serves as a kind of training ground of what we could do if we end up in that situation that might save our lives. Watching them can also be a kind of desensitization training, where if we find ourselves in that situation, we'll feel more prepared and less likely to freak out and panic. Even so, for a lot of fans, it can still kind of feel like a guilty pleasure. To be fair, there are some very valid criticisms of the true crime genre. But before we get into that, if you're enjoying this video, please like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support me so I can create more nerdy content, you can find me on Patreon. The link is in the description. So let's get into it. Okay, this one is a fair criticism. There's no way to slice it any other way. True crime fans want to consume stories about other people getting murdered. But you could make the same criticism about the nightly news. Stories about murder and other violent crime always get more airtime. There's literally a saying in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. But these are not the same as the times of the lurid tabloids and pulp magazines. True crime shows and traditional media both try really hard to show a lot of sympathy and empathy for the victims and the families. Most true crime shows, like most news stories, bring in the victim's family so we can learn a little bit more about this person and why they deserve justice. True crime shows, at least the modern ones, usually take an even deeper dive into the victim's life, and usually this is with the help of their families. Now, this can be difficult when we're talking about a serial killer who has multiple victims, or when the victims are so marginalized they don't have any loved ones to speak for them. But one of the hallmarks of today's kinder, gentler true crime stories are that we really try to keep the focus on the victim and on getting justice for them. That was certainly the case in the past. The message that if she hadn't have been doing that risky behavior, she wouldn't have gotten killed was often implied, if not stated outright. That idea that women are responsible for avoiding becoming victims has been part of our culture for a long, long time. And while we're starting to challenge it, it's still pretty embedded in our collective psyche. But it is being challenged. Modern true crime shows are starting to advocate more for the rights of sex workers, the term these workers prefer to be called, and marginalized people, such as people experiencing homelessness, addiction, or mental health issues, the very people who are most at risk for becoming victims of violent crime. It is true that the vast majority of true crime shows are about the police who solve the murder. It's kind of baked into the genre. Most murders that are solved by the police. But not all true crime blindly worships the cops. Forensic Files featured more than one story where the local police didn't really do their job, and some other agency, whether it was a private detective or a federal agency, had to step in to get to the truth. Several of the most popular true crime documentaries nowadays have to do with the way the police or courts have actually perpetrated injustice. From Ava DuVernay's When They See Us about the wrongful conviction of the Central Park Five, to The Confession Killer about Henry Lee Lucas, who duped the Texas Rangers and a whole lot of other law enforcement officials. Laura Padlin's award-winning documentary Unseen and the upcoming Netflix series Monster both focus on the ways that the police failed to take seriously the disappearances of marginalized people, which allowed the serial killers Anthony Sowell and Jeffrey Dahmer, respectively, to continue killing people. It is true that most true crime shows and documentaries have the same bias as the mainstream media. Stories featuring conventionally attractive middle and upper class white people get a lot more airtime. But as true crime audiences have gotten more progressive, so too has that media. More shows and documentaries are being produced featuring a more diverse cast. I really like Homicide Hunter, Lieutenant Joe Kenda, for just this reason. The show features some of the 400 cases or so that Kenda has solved in his career as a homicide detective in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Because the town itself is very diverse, the victims featured on the show are very diverse. And Kenda is adamant that every victim deserves justice. And seeing that wide range of victims, Black, white, Latinx, Asian, from the homeless to the wealthy and everything in between, highlights our common humanity and the sad fact that bad things can happen to anybody. But even more importantly, we're starting to see more true crime shows being hosted by people of color. Deadline Crime with Tamron Hall first aired in 2013 and is still airing today. I Am Homicide with Gary McFadden, Murder Chose Me with Rod Demery, and Scene of the Crime with Tony Harris, just to name a few, are shows hosted by former police investigators of color. While we've still got a ways to go, it's heartening to see that progress is being made. It's up to content creators like myself to strive for equity in the cases that we cover and to treat all victims, including marginalized people, with dignity and to hold the cops accountable when they mess up. And it's up to content consumers like you to demand the same from us. What are your thoughts on true crime? Why do you enjoy it or not? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Thanks, and till next time, Darklings.